Hello, and welcome to another episode of Metaviews. Today, this is our weekly Salon issue where we like to bring together some of our Metaviews members to really circle a conversation around an interesting topic. Sometimes it's a specific topic, sometimes it's a general topic. Today, it's kind of like a combination of the two, and actually bring my microphone in. In that decentralization is both a very huge, a very broad, sweeping subject, but it's also kind of specialized because of the nature of who it attracts and the types of projects that are under the decentralized banner. So I kind of feel it allows for a very unique meta views in that it allows for the big picture and the small picture. Now, the way our salons tend to operate is we bring together our Metaviews members who traditionally this has been done via Zoom, but we're trying to phase off Zoom for some really obvious reasons. And so today we're experimenting with OBS Ninja, which is a free and open source tool designed to easily integrate into OBS Studio, but it's also a standalone, and it uses a decentralized networking method or protocol to allow the video streams to work for all participants. So, as a kind of intro to sort of set the stage, I felt that decentralization, and today's topic is, decentralization, what is it? I kind of wanted to ask such an open-ended question because I feel that as a concept, it comes up a lot in Metaviews. Like we sort of assume it as a virtue, right? We assume it as something that we're pursuing, and maybe we should interrogate that assumption. Maybe we should dissect that assumption. Similarly, I would like to explore examples of decentralization and ways in which both on a technology level, but also on a political economic level, that we're starting to see society decentralize in general. And for me, the kind of aha moment, and when I say aha moment, I mean, McLuhan often talked about how fish don't know the taste of water. And I feel that we often take for granted that which is closest to us. Someone pointed out to me that I'm practicing decentralization because I moved out of the city, right? Because I left Toronto and I decided to live kind of on the periphery of contemporary society. I had never thought of it that way. I sort of thought of it more as a selfish thing of I didn't like people and I wanted some space between me. But perhaps instinctively, I was also seeking out that kind of decentralization. So why don't we start today's session? Because we don't have a lead. We're not asking someone to kind of step forward and make the argument. Why don't we do a go round and sort of ask the question, what does decentralization mean to you? What is your relationship to decentralization? What's your interest in decentralization? And Ken, I'm going to ask you to go first, if only because you had the decency to show up first when we were trying to get this together. So props to you for being early, but maybe punishment because I'm asking you to go first here.
What does decentralization mean to me? Well, originally...
and first, I got to turn the echo off. Okay, got it. Go ahead. Sorry.
Originally, when I got on the internet, and it was all Usenet before the web, having a voice and being able to speak freely and become basically, well, they try to label us publishers, and this all came to a great head with the whole Karla Homolka trial ban publication, the idea being that we didn't want to prejudice jurors by publishing information that hadn't gone through a trial yet. So it was a trial ban. So we just created a news group just to talk about the whole topic. And we were 19 or 20-year-old pissants. So we created a alt fan Carla Homolka to suggest that we are fans of her just to get attention and to outrage people, which of course worked. But the greatest moment of the whole saga of, people posting possibly true information, a lot of people posting false information, a lot of people griefing because it was such a sensitive subject about Carla Homolka being such a horrible criminal and people shouldn't be celebrating her, and no one understanding how the internet or Usenet really worked. We had our Attorney General of Ontario saying to shut down this internet thing until the trial was over. And so that was the kind of disruption that was obviously very effective at the time, in that we became some sort of publisher, which they tried to use the laws against publishers, against internet providers, which were few and far between, and mostly university and other tech corporations. And of
Now,
course that
let
didn't
me
work.
just interrupt real quick. Let me interrupt real quick and just point out something you just said that's worth repeating. That the Ontario government, the Attorney General for the Ontario government, wanted to shut down the internet.
Yeah, well, at
Right?
least
To
in
say that
Ontario.
now
Yeah.
seems absurd,
Yeah,
right?
well, they said to shut it down in Ontario. They later qualified, but still, and I mean, the universities didn't want to find out how this was going to be done, though I thought that, at the time they should have protected it and fought this through and litigated it through in our courts if we're going to decide how this technology is going to integrate with our society. But they all cowered away, and it's very funny what they did, which was effective enough to meet the requirements, was to just junk the news group. All that does is it means it doesn't sort it into any specific heading, but you can go and find the messages if you just read through the junk news group, which is where everything that's not carried officially ends up. So with search tools at the time, it was easy. So that was
Well, and hold on, to your point, because Usenet is and was decentralized, can you not still find those messages now?
yeah, you can. The archives are spotty. I went back and tried to look for some of my earliest posts on Usenet on legitimate groups, mostly talking about music at the time, which was my interest. It's very difficult to even find what's specifically my earliest post. I found some from the first year, but I know that there's earlier ones. Google has archived most of it, and it is there, but it's hard to find, which is funny, which is a different topic for later. It's just being buried in that the search tools are not publicly powerful enough to do a quick search to find this stuff. But it is out there, which makes me worry somewhat too. But the whole point was that we became a voice, and we had a quote unquote publishing platform. I mean, we did before with BBSs, but that was like a niche hobby between supposed super nerds. But many of those people went on and became part of the internet infrastructure in Ontario, where their names appear in much of the history. So decentralization back then seemed like a way for everybody to be given a voice and allowed to talk. Of course, I didn't think that through. Being exposed as a young man to only people who were, say, studying at University of Toronto, and my other BBS nerd friends who were very conversant and pretty well educated, as a nice side effect of our privileged lives. And I figured that everybody else would, even if they weren't as well educated, would use the medium for good. Of course, now we've seen with the attack on the U.S. Capitol, that's turned itself on its head, and it's got me thinking very differently about decentralization now, as I see parlors being shut down, and this new one that there's a new data dump that just came out last day or two of conservative messaging about terrorism and stuff being dumped.
I believe it was
Uh,
Gab.
yeah, that's it. And I'm like trying to figure out how do you deal with this decentralization as a legitimate, like I used to be, quasi against the government for most things, let's have proper education and social support. And that's been my whole kind of socialist bent. But now I'd see, I really do want the government to survive, and not be replaced by some conservative view of what it would be. So apparently allowing these people free speech is a danger. I'm not saying that we shouldn't allow it, but we have to mitigate the danger somehow.
And I think, part of the power of Metaviews is that we allow for these conversations. We allow for someone like yourself, a lifetime supporter of free speech, to question your faith in the idea, which doesn't mean you're abandoning it, but it means you're amongst friends in terms of describing it. So, Sharita, we'll go in kind of clockwise order here. Sharita, I'm curious to hear What are your thoughts? What's your relationship to decentralization, and how does it frame, the way that you understand the world?
Well, I guess it connects to how I understand the world by, giving the answer of what it means to me as it depends, which is, much in a way like what Ken was saying. Certainly, in terms of community development and activists within community development, whether online or in real life, um, the whole idea of decentralization to me was always very positive, right? You get down to the grassroots level, and there you're going to find what people need and what they want. Now, just today, I was given an example of how decentralization might not work. I found out from a friend late last night that Sunnybrook is opening a registration service, or in a way, a portal for COVID vaccine. And they've opened it before the government has tried to open their portal on March 15th. So I'm thinking, okay, well, I guess I could do something with Sunnybrook, but then, my hospital is Mount Sinai, and and that decentralization, in terms of healthcare, I think, is going to be a complete shit show. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so again, it depends. And then it depends in terms of what you're going to do, who has the power, and how far that power goes. So that's where I am.
Mike, you want to jump in?
Sure, I think the
Oh, you're
points.
on.
Am I still
Go
on
ahead.
mute? Okay, yeah. So the points are totally valid that have been made already. So I'll just try to build on that. Probably, you know, as you know, and maybe some of the audience knows, I'm a Bitcoiner. So the terms consensus and decentralization come in that. But my introduction to both of those two terms, was the from Nunavut and Northwest Territories, who both have consensus governments, and then, especially in the case of Nunavut, who broke off from the Northwest Territories with a vision of decentralized government. So for them, it would be, instead of putting, because having everything in one capital, like like we do, or the rest of the country has done, they wanted to spread it out, and they have certain divisions of the government headquartered in different communities, right? But nature has taken a different course, and and it's made itself, just like, for whatever natural reasons, everything's sort of headquartered in Iqaluit, the capital. So I've sort of seen it from that point of view, and then tried to uh, you know these political concepts, trying to sort of correlate them to what I see in the Bitcoin community or elsewhere in technology with the internet decentralized. And yeah, I have a pretty um, I find it interesting seeing these concepts bantered about in two different things, and I learn a lot from that. And but yeah, I think we need to watch. Centralization is a good thing sometimes, and it's like a lever, right? And I know this from a technical point, and I think it applies from a political or otherwise point, is that you only need as much centralization or decentralization as necessary, right? It usually is expensive for decentralization. So, how much of it do you need and why? You have to really understand what you're getting for. And I think we don't do a good job at that part, is understanding why we need decentralization or centralization, the opposite. And what are we measuring, and what are the parameters to figure out that? Because I think that's the part we're doing a poor job at. The technologies are there. It's just that we're naive about some of the realities of centralization and decentralization. So I think I'll leave it at that for an introduction.
Well, and maybe that sort of parallels our AI discussions, right? That there's a role for automation, there's a role for no automation, there's a role for more data, sometimes there's a role for less data, and that we tend to fetishize these new things. We tend to fetishize these tools rather than, I think, what you're rightfully arguing, Mike, which is for more nuance, right, and more appropriate context. So, Sumit, in terms of us going in this clockwise sort of order, I'm curious to hear, like, what's your relationship with decentralization? What does the word decentralization evoke or mean for you?
I'll admit it's something I'm still coming to grips with, because the understanding of the term and the application of that term for me is still holds a huge gap. I we talk about decentralization as transfer of control and decision making, right? From a centralized entity to a group. We talk about it from the transfer of authority and responsibility, right? So there's a few key words that I think are important: authority and responsibility. Who holds them? What are we transferring to who? Control and decision making, at what stage, at what level. So those things are important. But I find, the things around decentralization that still come up for me are that in order for people to be able to participate, we have to create access to a framework. We have to create informed decision making, not sort of the or like this gambling sort of attitude that we have around our applications of it right now. And then, how does public policy get affected by all of this as we think about this, right? So the entire process of it, in my world, from a cybersecurity perspective, decentralization holds some pretty meaningful impact. Right? We talk about how do we, it eliminates single points of failure, for instance, in cybersecurity. We are talking about decentralization of data storage, which creates a much better secure framework. We're talking about traceability of records so that they're unalterable, right? So there's some clear applications within my world of cybersecurity. But as a general concept, I still feel that in order for it to truly democratize all of those pieces that I talked about, authority all the way up to decision making, the framework that needs to exist for that to happen is still largely lacking. So that's where I'm still trying to come to terms with what this means to me and how to really truly apply it, versus just dabbling and playing with it.
Well, and I think that notion of framework is brilliant, because, if we imagine decentralization but don't create the structures that enable it, we're just enabling a new centralization, right? We're enabling a new concentration of wealth or concentration of power, which for me is the difference in social media between platforms and protocols, right? Ken was describing Usenet, which was based on a protocol, so it's really hard to dominate, versus Facebook or Twitter. These are platforms, and so all roads lead back to Facebook, or all roads lead back to Twitter. Now, I do have to give a brief shout out to George Jessel, who posted a comment. I remember how long it took to download JPEGs from Ken's Usenet groups, but it was always worth the wait. And if I had my soundboard, I would do the modem sound now to have that screech remind us of what that was like. So, Neil, I mean, like many of us here, you've been on the internet for quite some time, and you've seen the way in which it's changed. I'm not asking you to speak to that directly, but what does decentralization mean to you, right? How do you, as a media educator, think about both the opportunities and the challenges of an increasingly decentralized media universe?
There's a number of ideas that come to mind. One of them is downloading. There's a downloading of responsibility. And so one of the things that alarms me, particularly as a media educator, is that the responsibility for the informed that Sumit was just referencing has been placed upon each person. And so there was a time when we could say, well, the government will take care of me, or I've got some critical thinkers that I've licensed in the form of a newspaper or a television or a radio station, and I'll listen to them and let them help me think through these things. And we don't have that comfort anymore. We don't have that reliability, and we have to start to become our own critical thinkers. It's being downloaded. But I'm thinking about some other downloading as well in terms of decentralization. I'm thinking about the fact that the Ontario government destroyed its PPE because it got outdated, and then didn't renew its PPE which jeopardize the lives of the lawn care workers and the lawn care residents. And that's a terrible thing, but it's something that's a downside of centralization. I suspect that if each of those lawn care homes had been given a budget, most of them would have kept their PPE up to date. Or even if half of them kept their PPE up to date, we wouldn't have seen those same deaths. So there could be a benefit of decentralization. I have been on the internet for a long time, and one of the things that we talked about in those early days was the difference between hierarchy and matrix. And so those are two terms that we need to consider. And so the hierarchy that existed, let's say up until about 1990 approximately, disappeared pretty rapidly after that. And now we're in a situation where we're in a very matrix situation. And we have to understand the implications of the matrix. And some of those are the responsibilities. I don't have as many people looking after my interests and taking care of me. The cloud is an example, I think, of centralization. And I have to tell you, Jesse, that I do my backups to my own drives, because I would rather not put them in the cloud, because I haven't heard of anything that has not yet been hacked. Everything gets hacked, and my hard drives are here, and I know they're not getting hacked because they're here. So there's an example of centralization for me. But the third thing I'm thinking about is Marshall McLuhan's notion of acoustic space. And I've puzzled with this for a very long time. I have to admit that I've had a hard time understanding it, and I'm just starting to understand it now in the last several months. But the idea of acoustic space has, I think, a connection to centralization and decentralization. And it's the idea that I am at the center in acoustic space, and you are at your center in acoustic space. And so your moving out of Toronto could be seen as just symptomatic of acoustic space. The fact that you don't need to be here anymore. You've been able to take your center to your farm and work productively on your farm. And so we don't have to be going downtown anymore to hobnob with the other downtowners and to have that centralized culture. It'll be interesting. This was predicted prior to the internet, that cities would become obsolete and dissolve. I'm not sure that's happening, and I'm sure it's not happening in any rapid direction, but I think it's happening in some degrees. So that's another thing that I've been thinking about.
Well, and I think the pandemic has certainly incentivized people to think about living outside of the city, and that if they are going to be isolated, if they are going to be locked down, it's nice to be in nature when you're doing it. But Neil, I thought your point about cloud computing was spot on, because cloud computing offers itself as decentralized. It, on a technical level, partly is centralized because of the way in which it organizes data, but it's also entirely centralized because you're giving all your data to Amazon, or you're giving all your data to that cloud provider. And I think the same paradox applies to the resurgence of what you describe as acoustic space. That here on Twitch, everybody gets their own channel. And on that channel, it's somewhat visual. It's mostly acoustic. It's mostly oral, right? Like what we're doing right now here on Twitch, there's a lot of other people who have similar chats and similar conversations. And because everyone can host their own channel, there is a sense of decentralization that you are the center. But the paradox being that, no, Twitch is the center. Amazon is the center. Right. These acoustic spaces are just extensions of this center that create the illusion of decentralization.
Well,
and I think that's the paradox. Sorry, quickly.
What Amazon did to Parler, I think, is a pretty strong example of centralization, right?
Well, it is.
And what Twitter did to Trump is an example of centralization.
Well, and it's the exercise of power. Right? And I think another issue we should think about is, how does the exercise of power look different in a centralized versus a decentralized environment? Now, Merlatron, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but I want to just jump to our chat and read out what I thought was a really interesting and a relevant comment in terms of the discussion. And it comes from our new friend Doofus Tumish, who points out that other than the dependency on the Indian Act, First Nations have been a good primer for the decentralized model. Indigenous peoples as a pan subject. He says, thanks, Mike, for your perspective with Bitcoin architecture, and connections on data sovereignty are essential. But it does suggest that here in Canada, we have a model that looks at sort of a decentralized society and decentralized governments, which are the hundreds of First Nations that exist across the country. And like our conversation yesterday, those emerging governance models provide a lot of insights in terms of how we should govern ourselves in the internet era and on the internet in general. Lucent also points out that I'm guessing that's the Free Software Foundation, that there is no cloud, it's just someone else's computer. And that is perhaps a very sober way of thinking of cloud computing. Although I used to joke that we could call cloud computing clown computing. And do you really want to go upload your data to the clown? Ken, I want to get your thoughts on this in a moment, but it's Merlatron's term in our original go-round. So, Merle, I'm curious, what is your relationship with decentralization? What does the word decentralization evoke? And or, since that's what everyone else has done, what part of the emerging world of decentralization is currently capturing your interest or attention?
Well, I think the meaning has kind of evolved over time for me. I think, when I first heard the idea of decentralization, I'm thinking in terms of blockchain and Bitcoin. But, more recently, I've been learning about non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, and the way they're being used for art, digital assets, and video games. And this idea that you can have this whole society in a decentralized kind of network. People are trying to do this with video games, essentially, where you can buy with real money, with Ether, but, which you get with real money, these parcels of land in a digital world, and the idea that they're decentralized and kind of spread around the world on different servers, and that makes them I guess redundant or a safe investment. I think there's definitely a lot of issues around that. Like, particularly one thing I've been thinking about more recently with just on the notion of blockchain and these other technologies is, like, on the one hand, the environmental impact, because I think running these databases and, GPUs, like thousands of GPUs to mine cryptocurrency, like, is definitely going to have a strong environmental impact. The other thing is sort of the digital divide, and the fact that, it's expensive to have a GPU, to have a computer, to have the VR technology that's going to allow you to access this secondary society. And that, I would think that the majority of the human population on Earth does not have access to these decentralized technologies, and may never in their lifetime. I think that's an issue, because we're exacerbating this divide between society and humanity. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing. I think, one of the biggest things that has been attractive to me is the idea of redundancy, that, by distributing this data or whatever it is, this system, that there is no one person that controls it, and that it is distributed. And so there can be, like, democratic benefits to that. But on the other hand, I think of, like, the internet and how, the whole idea is that the internet should be decentralized. And I think it is to some degree, but that there's also, like, we still have 151 front, right? There's all these hubs of centralization. And I'm not sure what the right balance is, but I don't think that we're entirely decentralized or not. Anyways, I'm sort of ranting now, but those are my thoughts.
But I think you raise an interesting point in terms of the literacy of decentralization, because when we talked about the current military dictatorship in Myanmar, we were lamenting that the activists, the young people resisting that dictatorship did not have, let's say, the same level of decentralized literacy that protesters in Hong Kong have had in terms of knowing how to protect themselves and knowing how to organize. Lucent W in the chat has pointed out that there's a history of decentralized technology like BitTorrent, like Tor, that have started to help people wrap their heads around it. And he also talks about how IRC was once thought of as decentralized or versus centralized. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, Ken. But Merlatron, Doofus Toomish pointed out, full disclosure, they own 2 crypto kitties, which I thought was kind of hilarious, because clearly these types of objects are going out there. So, rather than do another go round, I'm sure all of you guys have stuff to say. And, unlike Zoom where we had the thumbs up feature, it's a little bit more of a free for all here with OBS Ninja. So I'm going to throw to Ken, but that doesn't mean that we're going around the circle. So the rest of you guys, feel free to jump in as soon as you feel that Ken has provided you with an opportunity to get a word in edgewise. But Ken, there was a lot of stuff there that I saw you reacting to, but that I'm also curious to get your thoughts on. Why don't we start with, why do you still find that IRC is your best messaging or communication medium of choice? Are you on mute, Ken?
There we go. Okay. IRC, because it's partially centralized in some way. So it creates a persistence that messaging, like on Facebook, I mean, you can create groups, and same with Skype, you've had the ability to do that for 10 years in Skype to create a persistent group, but it doesn't have the same feel. And this is where I'm sure McLuhan had a lot to say, where let me extend and abuse his metaphor, where the medium is the furniture. It gives you a kind of sense of the space, even if this isn't Second Life, where we've actually put, crappy low-level graphics of chairs and tables and people smoking and drinking coffee in the room. But IRC has a different feel, and it even has a pretty different feel from Discord, even though Discord is IRC on steroids. There's a kind of commitment to the age of the technology as well, that kind of enforces a certain attitude that that the people, it's a shibboleth, in that if you know IRC and are comfortable with it, that's your gateway to entry. I mean, we welcome everybody who wants to try to get in there. And I've been training Dan Zacks, who's listening to this stream, to try to use IRC more, so he can be one of the cool kids. But it's a bit of a learning process, apparently, for people who haven't been using it for a long time.
Allow me to quickly intervene and say, Dan, if you join our Discord, I'll create a bot that connects it to Ken's IRC server, so that way everybody's happy. Sorry, Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, so there you go. So there's gateways, and there's been gateway tools that have allowed merging Skype into IRC, for example, which was one of the hardest things. But because of the centralization of it, but as you say, it's centralization around a protocol, not a business unit. Right, like you said, everything leads to Facebook. Well, Freenode, for example, might be the monolithic nowadays. It used to be EFNet, decades ago, monolithic IRC server network, but it is still, kind of run in a semi-decentralized, at least democratic structure. I'm not sure if they're a corporation or a nonprofit or what their deal is, but it is run on a consensus basis. How resistant that is to centralization of power, I don't know. So far, the network's still running and seems relatively stable for the last number of years, and it is kind of the hacker/programmer go-to space for that. And so there is some sort of recognition and persistence that centralization does provide. And if you get too decentralized, well, then you're just, then we can all be Salvador Dali and no one's talking to anybody because everything's completely disconnected and nothing's persistent. So that's a pretty important aspect of it. So there's, as you say, some balance in some ways. Culture itself is a
Well,
centralization. All these memes, these are centralizations of certain streams of discourse and of thinking, even, from Pepe all the way to cat memes. All of them are important to the movement.
Well, and I love that IRC kind of represents a more mature approach to decentralization, that it's not mutually exclusive. You need certain elements that are centralized. You want certain elements to be decentralized. Lucent also pointed out that Twitch's back end is basically an IRC server, that all Twitch channels are just IRC channels on a larger modified IRC server. So it suggests that what we want is the best of all worlds. Now, Mike, I keep sort of often when we do this show in the chat, you and I jest over the word blockchain because it's an emotional trigger for you. And as a Bitcoin advocate, as a decentralization advocate, because that's true of you geopolitically, what is it about blockchain that you find so upsetting, or why do you feel we should be directing our attention at Bitcoin rather than blockchain in terms of a viable example of decentralization?
Well, I just think people should understand what they're talking about, right? So, the blockchain is an artifact of the Bitcoin network, like, operating, right? So you kind of have to see why and where, and then the incentives involved with the mining and everything. You kind of have to understand that. And so you get people like, I don't know, Toronto's big on this. Like, the Tapscots of Toronto are saying the blockchain is the solution to everything. But they've just sort of taken what they can make sense of from Bitcoin and putting it separately and saying, oh, that's the part that's magic. Well, it's not. I think Lucent W's had a lot of examples of certificate authorities and all these other blockchain looking things, but they're artifacts of a network doing something or people communicating, and then that's what's left over. So you have to kind of say, why does it look like a blockchain, or like what happened to get this blockchain, or what's the sense of it? And I see so little of that, and then people just use it as, let's be serious, they're using it to make money, like Bitcoin. Like the price went up so high, so everybody wants to duplicate that with Ethereum.
So if I understand you
other
correctly, we're seeing a bit of a Kleenex to tissue sort of phenomena, in which distributed databases predate blockchains, right?
Definitely,
and
there's tons of
now. Yeah, and now we're using that phrase. And let's, as much as I like to disparage Toronto, let's not give Toronto guilt by association with the Tapscots. The Tapscots are Muskoka, right? They're the Muskoka group. That is their actual name. Okay. So we'll just push them a little bit up into Muskoka and say Toronto.
That's perfect.
So,
that's perfect.
Sharita, Neil, Sumit, Murli, I'm curious what you guys think in terms of how this discussion is developing a kind of nuance in which it's not decentralization good, centralization bad, but more recognizing that we need the ability to configure. We need the ability to, as a kind of slider or a set of dials, be able to adjust accordingly. I mean, how do we tie this beyond technology back to cybersecurity, back to policy, media education, what have you?
I'd like to ask Mike
Sharita?
a question.
Neil can go. Then I'll.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I'd like to ask Mike a question because I probably need to fill in my own gaps. And it comes back to the connection between centralization and decentralization. Mike, am I correct that blockchain could connect to decentralization in that fraud is a harder thing to perpetrate? If I've got blockchain, doesn't that allow me to go back and check things and verify things and make sure that it's all going to work? So I could be less suspicious of a fraudster coming at me, because I think that we're getting a lot of fraud, pandemic related fraud right now. But there's a lot of worry about not Bitcoin precisely, but those general currencies, and worry about fraud there. But the blockchain allows me to actually verify, doesn't that? And therefore it could be an example of decentralization.
Yeah, definitely. Bitcoin is one thing, but the idea, I think, that you were getting at, of having sort of an authoritative source of records that can't be, you can get that with just sort of the time stamping part of Bitcoin. So I don't want to get off too complicated, but I think this is a good example of where the crossover between blockchain and cybersecurity is. I work on a project called Open Timestamps, and that sort of does do what a lot of these other sort of currencies supposedly are saying they're going to do, which is just make these permanent records of things that can't be altered after the fact. And I think you see this in a lot of cybersecurity products coming out, where you're just hashing things like crazy into each other with this constant record. Then you can always go back and say this is the order of things, but you don't necessarily have to have a cryptocurrency to do that. And you can, I think Lucent had had great examples of how you could federate this sort of idea of a chain of records. So I think, and Neil, I think it was you that brought up the original point that we're downloading the responsibility onto users or lower level people. And if you don't understand like some of the nuances of the things I just described, well, you're going to say, oh, this token sounds good to timestamp records. Well, I'll pay a token to do it. Well, you didn't need to. You could have just done it yourself. And then every once in a while you put that hash of all your records into Bitcoin, and then you get the same thing for free. So anyway, I'll leave it there.
Well, and allow me to use that to bring it back to Neil's example of the cloud, right? That Neil's like, well, I don't trust the cloud. I want to back up data to my device. And Mike, you just blew off explosions in my head, because even though it's self-evident to me, I don't think about it, that your argument is, a lot of these decentralized technologies don't need to be monetized. They don't have to have a token associated with them. They don't have to have a model of greed tacked onto the functionality, because, that's free and open source software. Free and open source software. Well, and some of it's,
I'll say, some of it's ridiculous. Like this, what Merlatron brought up about the non-fungible tokens. Well, if it's a digital asset, fine, right? We can say that belongs to them and trade it. But a picture of a piece of artwork, I mean, come on here. Like, so does that help someone not steal it? Or like, I don't get what's going on here with some of this stuff. So let's just, I'll let everyone else.
Well, and allow me to exercise my privilege as host to say, Merlatron and I are working on a special investigative report on non-fungible tokens that will be broadcast live here on Metaviews soon, because it's a special report, breaking news. But this idea that decentralized technology doesn't have to be a cryptocurrency, can be like free and open source software available for anyone to use anywhere, is, I think, a moral and virtue we should be re-emphasizing. And so far, I'm very happy with OBS Ninja as a free and open source alternative to Zoom for us to be using. Now, Sharita, I want to bring you into the conversation, because you were leaning in earlier in terms of sort of where you see this conversation going in terms of tying it back to politics and society.
What I was thinking about, and this may be a leap too far, but I keep thinking about, so is there another way of looking at this? So in terms of, let's say, a meta view would be to look at decentralization and centralization in terms of when it's appropriate or not, or when you should move from one to the other, would be to layer on top of that some social network theory. And when you do that, you may raise it above what we're talking about in terms of Bitcoin or government or federal. It takes it up a level so it goes across a number of disciplines that all talk about decentralization. If you were to look or do a quick search in terms of articles and journals, you will basically see that many disciplines look at specifically decentralization and centralization. So I'm wondering, just in my head, how I might layer that social network theory on top of this to get a different look, right? That's
Well, and
just where my mind was going.
the reason that I am susceptible, shall we say, or partial to Mike's critique of the blockchain world is that they are often unidisciplinary, right? They have very narrow perspectives, and that might be a technological perspective. Maybe it's an economic or monetary perspective in addition to the technology, but they rarely have a social analysis. They rarely have an anthropological analysis, let alone political economy in terms of the broader impact of how that works. So, Sumit, feel free to jump into this at any different perspective, but I'm almost inclined to bring this back to cybersecurity because a concept I've been working on lately is participatory cybersecurity. And it's the idea that if cybersecurity is ever going to be successful, it has to be multidisciplinary, right? It can't just be the technologists. You need some psychology in there. You need some sociology in there. You need all of these areas. So again, feel free to take this anywhere you want in terms of the threads that have come up today. But I also feel there's an opportunity to bring this back to cybersecurity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, all of those pieces that you mentioned is exactly the kind of work that's happening in the cybersecurity space right now, Jesse. I mean, we're talking about the economics of cybersecurity, the psyche of a cyber criminal, how do we create a culture of cybersecurity in a world in an era of digital transformation while people are trying to still wrap their head around those pieces. And those are critical. I mean, when we talk about cybersecurity and when I'm out there talking about its importance, one of the things that always keep coming back to is what is the framework by which we are helping people understand why this is important? How do we take it back to the basics? And the basics mean I have to explain to them the concept of data, where it's stored, what does privacy mean, why is it important, how do we use systems, and so all of those pieces, I think, fall into that concept of how decentralization of education within the cybersecurity framework could really assist us. But I digress for a moment because, I think I come back to Bitcoins and I know that word is sacred here and Mike, I want to use it carefully. And partially it's because of a lack of my own understanding. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, even though I put some money in it early on and it did okay. But I still, when somebody says, hey, Bitcoins, I'm like, I have no freaking clue where this is going. But when we look at Bitcoin, the challenge that I see is that most people's understanding of decentralization is coming from the concept and the promotion of this word Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, which actually is not accurate, right? Bitcoin and by default has some challenges that are actually not necessarily in line with the concept of decentralization completely, right? Often I think of Bitcoin almost as somewhat of a re-centralized system in that now that there's third-party exchanges popping up and now that we're looking at institutional money coming in, and now that we're looking at security flaws creeping in and we're trying to find ways to address that, I mean, I don't know where decentralization lies in that debate anymore. And then if we further start looking into, concepts of deflation and why Bitcoin can be inherently seen as deflationary, again, that takes us away from this general notion of centralized versus decentralized as we understand it. So why I raised that, Jesse, is that in this conversation for me, I think this is important for us to all wrap our heads around how we view it and what we are doing about it. But in order for it to have its true effect, where in our systems training, where in our systems teaching, where in our historical context are we referring back to concepts of centralization and decentralization? So people's knowledge and awareness of it is not coming from a system that many of us still don't know where it fits in as a category, right? So that's sort of just what pops up for me.
Well, and I think the concept of re-centralization is brilliant. and distinct from centralization or decentralization in terms of a different power dynamic. Because I once you said that, I was like, that's exactly how I've been thinking of the Bitcoin and blockchain world. That this isn't a revolutionary thing. It's a reconsolidation of wealth, but using a different medium. Because I don't see Bitcoin redistributing wealth. Rather, I see a different kind of centralized wealth. And I think that's why, if anything, the takeaway for me today is the nuance, right? When to know when to centralize, when to decentralize, and to have the flexibility for both, right? That if I was a general and I was imagining an army, I'd want the capacity to instantly centralize, as any general wants, while also instantly decentralize, the way any guerrilla commander would desire. And to maintain both of those capacities strikes me as a very powerful and privileged position for any commander to take. Now, there's a bunch of other threads that I think have come up. We are starting to run low on time, but we still got a few minutes. Other comments, other thoughts from the floor in general, while I give Harriet here a little treat, because you can see her little tail kind of flickering above. Neil, you wanted to jump in?
Just a couple of observations. The fact that you have moved from Zoom to OBS seems to me to be a centralization, decentralization statement. When you gave your announcement about your special report with Merlatron, you used a CBC voice, which is kind of a centralized voice, but it's not your usual voice. And I just wanted to make those observations because it's an inherent part of our worldview, of our discourse.
Well, and I have a completely different voice when I do the Cyberpunk show, which is this new voice that I've been cultivating. But that's very astute observations there, Neil. Other thoughts, comments?
Well, I was sort of thinking about how we're all kind of, as we've been discussing, it all comes back to like media literacy. We started this conversation out by like talking about what is decentralization, what does it mean, and it kind of means a couple different things to all of us. And if we want it to have these democratic effects, it does need to have a framework, and that the idea isn't enough. We have to understand it. Everyone who uses it has to understand it. And so it comes back to that concept of media literacy and education.
And agency.
Right on.
Yeah.
Well, that's the other thing about.
Mike? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Mike's unmuted. That's the other thing that we are seeing about the re-centralization, because the decentralization of financial instruments like Bitcoin, which is supposedly worth money to some people, is become a great attractor of attacks against it. And so providing your own security is become difficult even for experts. I mean, you have to have an incredible security hygiene to maintain your own wallets now if they have any tangible amounts, because it's easier to steal money from people who aren't security experts than it is to go steal a $5 million painting. There's way more security around a $5 million painting than most people's wallets, and some of these people have hundreds of Bitcoins in them, which is worth even more than that. Why would you bother dealing with supposed lasers shooting all over the room, as we've seen in movies, when you can just go sit outside in a car across the street from a guy's house and hack into his old Wi-Fi router and get onto his network and then start trying Windows exploits against whatever equipment he's got in his house. Right. So people don't want to risk that. It's too much work to manage your own security, and it's too much effort for me to manage my own security around my house. I rely on the police. So there's a centralization right there that I do rely on. And I give up some of my rights in exchange for having this police protection. But as we call that, shorthand is called society. It seems to be worth it overall. So that's a consideration, that this rampant I think it's a reflexive action that we've had over the last 20 years, especially amongst the left, because the central leaning governments, at least in Canada, have been resistant to any of the social changes that we want. They do come, but it's been very slow. Of course, leftists want it faster, and today. But we've been kind of, as I said, even myself, somewhat anti-government because of this resistance in producing these changes that we want. So we've been looking at decentralization, but then suddenly when it goes too far, when the right, who wants something completely different as a worldview than the left, puts it into action, we see when they left they left the gate open for the right to operate freely, whereas the left has been attacked. If you read about Trump's focus on the left and trying to make Antifa the terrorist group, they allowed the right wing groups to flourish. And they broke down some of the barriers of centralized resistance against the right, and they've decentralized and organized and caused the furor that we saw. And I think that now we are learning that there's obviously, to most people, it seems obvious who haven't delved into this, that there has to be some sort of balance. But I think that we're going to see is more codified, especially through stuff like blockchain, more codified stuff, especially like Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, which seems way off as a completely unrelated topic, but that kind of financial auditing and privacy auditing of companies, especially with the EU privacy regulations, those things are all coming in because now technology is allowing, and the governments are finally catching up, that we won't have stuff like Fonseca happen with the offshore tax havens. That kind of stuff can't go on, and the publishing and decentralization of information of these organizations who are operating supposedly in the shadows with the government's blessing, that's not going to be possible.
Well, and allow me to add to that, here at Metaviews, we talk about algorithmic audits and the need to have similar oversight over the way that algorithms work. And I think that is another check in the sense that algorithms enable decentralized decision making, because you can literally have that decision making automated. But you need some type of oversight as to how those decisions are being made so that there is some form of accountability. But Sumit, as Ken was describing how, it's more profitable to go and hack somebody's crypto wallet than it is to go and break into the Art Gallery of Ontario, that made me think of we should do a cybersecurity event where we sort of, talk about the solar winds and talk about the state of cybersecurity in the world. So I use my Jesse Twitch voice there to sort of flag that as a future conversation. Mike, did you want to jump in before we close things off?
Well, since I would like to say that, I think what's wrong with Bitcoin is not Bitcoin, it's the Bitcoiners, right? So they've made this centralized, all these exchanges, all these pumping of these tokens. They're too lazy to build something on Bitcoin, so they create some other scam, and so they've created a whole world of just nonsense. And I will say that at the beginning of Bitcoin, and I have to go around living this world where everyone thinks I'm rich because I was into Bitcoin in 2010 when it first started, or so it's all everything about Bitcoin is about money, about how about getting rich. And at the beginning, there was a lot of leftists in Bitcoin, and that changed pretty quickly. And now it's just an absolute shit show of idiots. Yeah.
Well, and it's very fitting on a channel that embraces cyberpunk that we would also, sort of say the problem's not with Bitcoin, it's the Bitcoiners.
Yeah.
They need to go back to their cyberpunk roots.
Go back.
Sorry,
to 20,
Neil, you wanted to jump in?
Start again.
Well, my understanding was that Bitcoin was designed as a response against the banks, and the usury, the rates the banks were charging, and the protections and the difficult policies they had. And in connection with your algorithm statement, Jesse, an algorithm is centralization because it's making the decision. And it's not letting me make the decision, but the Bitcoin was initially a response against the banks, but eventually it inevitably, because it's money, is going to attract the conservative point of view. And so I think Mike's quite correct.
Well, and allow me to push back, Neil, because while I would agree that an algorithm as an automated decision-making has a centralizing force, we are now seeing a world in which everyone can have their own algorithm. and everyone has their own relationship with that algorithm. So what I'm anticipating is the decentralization of that automated decision making, that, you know, to bring it back full circle to Ken's original concerns, that maybe we underestimated what happens when the genie is unleashed, right? When this technology is out there. And that's where I'm suggesting that a decentralized algorithmic media environment, which is where I think we're heading, has even more implications than we've been able to address today. But unless anyone has any final pressing comments that they would like to share, I'm going to wrap up what has been... sorry, Neil, you wanted to quickly?
Well, violence, and we're talking about a form of violence here. Violence is very educational. And so when things get out of whack, when things go way off into a radical direction, that becomes educational. And then we learn from that and we try to rebalance.
I mean, I agree with you in the general. The danger there is, you know, what is the lesson, right? Or, you know, how is that education playing out? And unfortunately, you know, that's where I'm not always, certainly in the context of the American education system, I'm not always confident that the lessons taken or the lessons learned are going to be the ones that we desire. But I do thank all of you for what I thought was a fantastic salon. Big thanks to our participants in the chat, Lucent W, Toofus Toomish, two of the more active. As we end every Metaviews show, the irony here, of course, is that where in traditional television, when the show is over, the viewer changes the channel. But here on Twitch, the channel changes the channel, and we're the one who sort of decides where the audience goes. The audience, of course, because they're decentralized, they can go wherever they want to go. So it is a bit of a give and take. So I'm just taking a moment here to see who is streaming, and let's go to the Unruly Quilter. So those of you who are still watching along on Twitch, I ask that you stay with us and join us in this raid to our friend, the Unruly Quilter, both to show Emily, the Unruly Quilter, some love, but also so that we might support other fellow streamers. So this has been the weekly Metaviews Salon. Thanks to our Metaviews members who participated. Thanks to our chat members who participated. We'll be back this evening with our Farm Chores show. But as I mentioned, stay tuned for a special breaking news investigative report with myself and Merlatron onto the rise of NFTs and non-fungible tokens. With that said, thanks again, and we'll see you all quite soon.